Tonight, you'll fall asleep learning why your spaghetti sauce once scared the nobility to death. Welcome, dear listener, as the candles flicker and the night wraps around you like a velvet cloak. Draw your blankets closer as we journey back through the mists of time to a world where something as innocent as a tomato could strike terror into the hearts of even the bravest souls. Yes, that plump crimson fruit resting in your kitchen, perhaps destined for tomorrow's salad, was once regarded with the same fearful reverence as a serpent in paradise, a harbinger of doom, a silent messenger of death. You would have seen it first perhaps on a nobleman's table, where curiosities from the New World were displayed more as conversation pieces than as sustenance. The year might have been 1523, or thereabouts, as the Spanish conquistadors began sending back strange treasures from the lands they had brutally claimed. Among gold and exotic feathers came seeds and plants unknown to European eyes, and the tomato, with its vivid crimson flesh, arrived with no instruction manual, no warning label, only its unsettling resemblance to things Europeans already feared. Imagine yourself there, in a drafty stone castle, where tapestries struggle futilely against the persistent chill. The great hall is lit by tallow candles that sputter and smoke, casting elongated shadows across the faces of wary diners. A servant approaches with a strange platter, upon which rest several small round objects of an alarmingly bright hue, not the muted colors of European produce, but something almost unnaturally vivid, a red so intense it seems to pulse with its own inner light. What manner of fruit is this? Someone would inevitably ask. Perhaps a lady whose fingers are stained with the subtle poisons of her lead-based face powder, unaware that one danger sits upon her skin while she fears another on her plate. It comes from the New World, the host might answer, his voice lowered as though discussing something faintly improper. The savages there eat it, though whether for nourishment or as part of their heathen rituals, none can say for certain. You would lean closer perhaps, curiosity momentarily overcoming caution. In the candlelight, the tomato's skin gleams wetly, like something freshly wounded. When cut, its interior reveals chambers filled with slippery seeds suspended in a gelatinous substance, nothing like the familiar apples and pears of European orchards. The very structure seems alien, unsettling, a thing not meant for Christian consumption. The tomato's arrival coincided with an era when the medieval mind was still deeply entrenched in symbolic thinking. Foods were not merely sustenance, but carried moral and spiritual significance. White foods were pure, dark foods mysterious, and red. Red was the color of blood, of passion, of danger. A red food, especially one with such moist seed-filled chambers, presented a philosophical conundrum before it ever presented a culinary one. The concept of the Columbian exchange, that massive transfer of plants, animals, culture, human populations, technologies, and ideas between the Americas, West Africa, and the Old World, was not understood as a single phenomenon by those living through it. For the average European, strange new things simply appeared, brought by travelers from increasingly distant lands, each object carrying its own mythology, whispered warnings, and lingering questions. Tomatoes arrived in Europe alongside other nightshades, potatoes, eggplants, bell peppers, and tobacco. This family connection would prove significant in the tomato's troubled European reception, for Europeans already knew of deadly nightshades growing in their midst, particularly the aptly named deadly nightshade, or belladonna, whose attractive purple-black berries could cause hallucinations, delirium, and death. The physical resemblance between tomato plants and these known poisonous relatives did nothing to encourage culinary experimentation. Consider that in this time of limited scientific understanding, the doctrine of signatures, the belief that herbs resembling various parts of the body could cure ailments of those parts, was still influential in both medicine and folk wisdom. A heart-shaped herb might be prescribed for cardiac concerns, a yellow plant might treat jaundice. By this same token, a fruit resembling established poisons might reasonably be assumed poisonous itself. The medieval and Renaissance mind was attuned to these visual connections in ways we have largely forgotten. In the kitchens of Europe, where you might find yourself lingering if born to a certain station, cooking was less a matter of written recipes than of oral tradition, of knowledge passed from mother to daughter, from master to apprentice. New ingredients could not simply be incorporated through experimentation. Without understanding their properties, cooks could not know how to balance them with existing flavors, how long to cook them, whether to serve them raw or prepared. A tomato, with its high water content and acidic nature, behaved unlike anything in the European culinary repertoire. The first documented European mention of tomatoes comes from the Italian herbalist Pietro Andrea Mattioli, who in 1544 described them as mala aurea, or golden apples. This suggests the earliest European tomatoes were yellow rather than red, perhaps slightly less threatening in appearance, but still regarded with suspicion. Mattioli catalogued them alongside medicinal plants, not foodstuffs, an important distinction in a time when the boundary between food and medicine was often blurred. You would have heard rumors, perhaps, standing in the herb garden of a monastery where monks cultivated healing plants alongside kitchen staples. A traveling brother might have whispered of these golden apples or love apples grown in Italy or Spain, grown but rarely eaten. The stories would conflict. Some claimed the fruit caused fever, others madness. Some suggested it was an aphrodisiac, hence love apple, dangerous not for its toxicity, but for its power to inflame inappropriate passions. The confusion surrounding tomatoes was compounded by genuine gaps in medical knowledge. Digestive ailments, fevers, and sudden deaths were common in an era before germ theory, before understanding of food contamination, before awareness of how diseases spread. When a nobleman fell ill after a feast featuring new foods, it seemed only logical to blame the unfamiliar ingredient rather than the poor sanitation, the bacteria-laden water, or any of the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh was heir to. Had you been able to observe with modern eyes, you would have noticed something significant. Those most likely to experiment with tomatoes were precisely those most vulnerable to certain hidden dangers. The nobility ate from pewter plates and used utensils containing lead. The acidity of tomatoes could leach lead from these implements, causing lead poisoning, whose symptoms, pain, confusion, fatigue, and eventually death, might easily be mistaken for the effects of a natural toxin in the fruit itself. In the marketplace, where common folk gathered to trade goods and gossip in equal measure, you might have overheard conversations about these strange new fruits appearing in the gardens of the wealthy. They grow them for ornament only. A fishwife might tell her neighbor, adjusting her basket of eels on one ample hip. Beautiful but deadly, like those ladies at court with their painted faces. "Thais, my cousin's friend serves in the house of Lord such and such," another might reply, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "and she says they served them to an unwelcome guest, knowing full well what would happen. He died in terrible agony before dawn." Such rumors spiraled and evolved with each telling. The tomato became entangled with stories of intentional poisonings, a not uncommon occurrence in Renaissance courts, where political assassination by poison was a refined art. What better cover for murder than serving a fruit already rumored to be toxic? European botanical texts of the period reflect this confusion. John Gerard's influential Herbal 1597 described tomatoes as likely poisonous, though he acknowledged they were eaten in Spain and Italy. He claimed without evidence that the tomato was narcotic and could cause venomous headaches and of a stinking and virulent smell. Gerard recommended growing tomatoes only for ornamental purposes, admiring their beauty while avoiding their fruit. Had you been a gardener in this era, you might have planted a tomato solely for its exotic appearance, training it up a trellis in your ornamental garden where visitors could admire its unusual form without risking its supposedly deadly fruit. The plant itself was undeniably attractive, verdant and sprawling, with delicate yellow flowers giving way to fruit that transformed from green to gold to vibrant red as it ripened. Beautiful and dangerous, the perfect combination to titillate the Renaissance imagination. The medical wisdom of the time, still heavily influenced by the ancient Greek physician Galen's theory of the four humours, classified all foods according to their supposed effects on the body's balance of blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. New foods, like tomatoes, had no place in this established system. Were they heating or cooling? Did they increase moisture or dryness? Without this classification, physicians could not recommend how, when, or whether to consume them. You might have consulted, if literate and fortunate enough to access such texts, herbals and medical compendia seeking guidance. There you would find tomatoes categorized variously as cold and moist, qualities associated with phlegm and illness, or hot and moist, potentially fever-inducing. Such contradictions did little to encourage culinary adoption. Religious considerations further complicated the tomato's reception. In a Europe divided by the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, where religious authorities still wielded tremendous influence over daily life, new foods could become entangled in theological debates. If God had intended Europeans to eat these fruits, why had he not placed them in the Garden of Eden, or at least in European soils? Some argued that New World products were not mentioned in the Bible, and therefore should be regarded with suspicion. The Spanish and Portuguese, as the primary colonial powers in tomato-growing regions, were among the first Europeans to witness native peoples consuming tomatoes without ill effect. Yet even this evidence traveled slowly across European borders, filtered through colonial prejudices that regarded indigenous knowledge as inherently inferior to European learning. A Spanish colonial account describing Aztecs eating tomatoes in a sauce with chili peppers and squash seeds might be dismissed by a French physician as evidence only of barbaric tastes and supernatural resistance to toxins. Moving through a typical medieval or Renaissance marketplace, your senses would have been assaulted by the familiar aromas of local produce, the earthy scent of root vegetables, the sweetness of apples and pears, the sharp tang of onions and garlic. The tomato, when it eventually appeared, offered an unfamiliar scent, slightly grassy, faintly sweet, with an acidic undertone unlike European fruits. This sensory unfamiliarity reinforced its status as an outsider, something not quite belonging in European cuisine. The preparation of food in this era involved a delicate balance of flavors according to established principles. Medieval and Renaissance cookbooks emphasize combinations meant to complement each other, according to humoral theory, balancing, for instance, the coldness of fish with warming spices. Tomatoes, with their bright acidity, fit poorly into these established patterns. They cut through the sweet, spicy profiles favored in aristocratic dining, introducing a tanginess that seemed to conflict with prevailing tastes. In the rare kitchens where tomatoes were experimentally prepared, cooks would have been further puzzled by how cooking transformed them. A fruit that begins firm and structured collapses into a watery sauce when heated, thickening only through extensive reduction. This behavior resembled no other European fruit and required cooking techniques not yet developed. The tomato demanded a new culinary language that would take centuries to evolve. Had you been a physician in this period, trained in the medical theories of Galen and Avicenna, you would have approached the tomato with scholarly caution. Your medical text might include a careful drawing of the plant, alongside warnings about its family resemblance to known poisons. You might have prescribed tiny amounts, a few seeds perhaps, or a sliver of flesh, to treat specific ailments, while warning against larger consumption. For the average European, these complexities mattered little. What registered was simply that these bright fruits from distant shores were regarded with suspicion by authorities. Better to stick with the familiar turnips, cabbages, and apples that had sustained generations than risk one's health on exotic novelties. As twilight deepens and the candle burns lower, consider how slowly knowledge traveled in this world before instant communication. A successful tomato harvest and feast in Seville might remain unknown in London or Vienna for years. A case of illness blamed on tomatoes in Florence could spawn rumors that traveled faster than accurate information about safe preparation methods. The tomato's reputation developed in this fragmented, inconsistent manner, accepted in some regions while feared in others. As the first century of the tomato's European presence drew to a close, its status remained ambiguous. In parts of Italy and Spain, particularly in coastal areas with more exposure to foreign influences, tomatoes began appearing in local cuisine, though often heavily disguised with familiar flavors. Elsewhere, they remained primarily ornamental curiosities, admired for their beauty but approached with caution when it came to consumption. This cautious reception was not unique to tomatoes. Potatoes, corn, and many other New World foods faced similar resistance. European bodies and European cooking traditions had co-evolved over thousands of years. New ingredients required not just new recipes, but new understandings of how food worked, how flavors combined, how nutrients sustained the body. The tomato asked Europeans to reconsider assumptions deeply embedded in their culinary consciousness. As you drift towards sleep, imagine that uncertain moment when the first brave European, perhaps a gardener sampling the fruits of their labor, perhaps a chef seeking to impress with novelty, bit into a ripe tomato despite all warnings. The burst of unfamiliar flavor, the momentary fear of possible consequences, followed by the anticlimactic reality. No immediate death, no visions, no illness, just an unusual taste, neither wholly pleasant nor wholly objectionable to the unaccustomed palate. A small moment of culinary courage that would eventually, over centuries, transform European cooking forever. But that transformation lay far in the future. For now, the tomato remained a frightening newcomer, its bright color a warning flag, its resemblance to deadly nightshade a cause for justified concern. In the candlelit halls and shadowed kitchens of medieval and Renaissance Europe, to contemplate the tomato was to contemplate risk itself, the risk of the unknown, the foreign, the untested. And in a world where medicine offered few remedies for poison, such risks seemed hardly worth taking for mere culinary pleasure. The candle gutters as a draught whispers through the chamber. Pull your blankets closer as we delve deeper into the darkening tale of the tomato's sinister reputation. Night has fully descended now, and with it come the shadows where superstition thrives, where whispers of witchcraft and devilry take root in the fertile soil of human fear. You find yourself now in the shadowed corners of medieval and Renaissance Europe, where color carried significance beyond mere appearance. Red, the color of blood, of life force spilled, held particular power in the medieval imagination. Red foods were approached with a complex mixture of desire and dread. The vibrant crimson of the ripened tomato spoke to deeper fears, fears of contamination, of hidden dangers, of spiritual corruption. Had you lived then, you might have known the old folk wisdom. Red berries in the forest were to be avoided unless positively identified as safe. Red toadstools sprouting after rain portended death. Red flux from the body signaled serious illness. Is it any wonder then that a fruit bleeding red when cut would be regarded with instinctive suspicion? The tomato seems to weep a substance uncomfortably reminiscent of diluted blood, its seed-filled chambers like some strange alien anatomy. In the kitchens of great houses, where you might serve if born to certain circumstances, the cook would have warned you about unfamiliar red fruits. "The devil favors red," she might murmur, crossing herself. "Remember the apple that tempted Eve? Some say it was not as our apples, but red through and through." Such biblical associations, however historically inaccurate, colored perceptions of all red fruits, but especially newcomers without established reputations for safety. The tomato's association with the deadly nightshade family, Solanaceae, sealed its villainous reputation. This botanical family includes not only edible members like potatoes and eggplants, but also belladonna, henbane, and mandrake plants, long associated with witchcraft, poison, and dark magic. In the medieval and Renaissance pharmacopoeia, these nightshades featured prominently as both medicines and poisons, their power respected and feared. Belladonna, whose name means beautiful lady in Italian, earned this moniker from its use as a beauty aid. Women applied drops to dilate their pupils, creating the wide-eyed look considered attractive, yet the same substance, consumed orally, caused hallucinations, delirium, and death. The physical resemblance between tomato plants and belladonna, similar leaves, similar growth habits, did not escape notice. Why would nature create such similarity, unless to signal similar properties? You might have heard, on a winter's night when the work was done, and stories flowed as freely as ale, tales of witches using nightshade ointments to achieve flight. The active compounds in belladonna, henbane, and mandrake, when absorbed through the skin, could indeed cause sensations of flying or floating, along with vivid hallucinations and delirium. These witches' brews and flying ointments featured in both witch trial testimonies and medical texts of the period. The connection was clear to the medieval mind. If established nightshades facilitated witchcraft, might not this new nightshade, the tomato, serve similar unholy purposes? Legends began to circulate that witches used tomatoes in their concoctions, that the fruit's bright color came from pacts with the devil, that growing them in one's garden might attract supernatural attention of the most unwelcome kind. In the great stone-floored kitchen of a lord's manor, you might have overheard the more learned members of the household discussing classical connections. The Latin name given to tomatoes, Lycopersicum, translates literally as wolf peach, a name suggesting danger, predation, transformation. Some scholars trace this name to German werewolf legends, where nightshade plants were thought to be used by witches to summon werewolves. Others suggest it referred to the tomato's supposed aphrodisiac properties, awakening the wolf of lust in unsuspecting consumers. Alchemical texts of the period, with their obscure symbolism and search for transformative substances, sometimes mentioned red fruits in connection with their color-coded stages of the great work. The rubedo, or reddening, represented the final stage of the philosopher's stone, powerful but dangerous if approached incorrectly. The tomato's brilliant red, appearing almost alchemical in its intensity, compared to native European produce, evoked these esoteric associations. Some even whispered that alchemists cultivated tomatoes as sources of vital essences for their transmutations. Medical tomes, still heavily influenced by ancient authorities and increasingly divorced from practical observation, categorized tomatoes according to pre-existing frameworks that did little to clarify their actual properties. The Galenic system classified tomatoes as cold and wet, qualities associated with phlegm, melancholy, and illness. According to this thinking, consuming such foods would increase these qualities in the body, potentially leading to imbalance and disease. Had you consulted Culpeper's famous herbal or similar texts of the period, you might have found the tomato described in terms both cautionary and contradictory. This fruit, brought from distant shores, partakes of the nature of Saturn in its coldness, yet Mars in its ruddy hue. It may prove useful in small quantities for cooling the blood in fevers, yet beware its excessive use, which engenders melancholy and visions. Renaissance witch trials, occurring across Europe with varying intensity from the 15th through the 17th centuries, coincided with the tomato's introduction. In some regions, growing unusual plants, particularly those with narcotic or toxic properties, could be considered evidence of witchcraft. A garden featuring unfamiliar nightshades might draw unwelcome attention from witch hunters. Prudent gardeners avoided such risks, reinforcing the tomato's status as suspicious and potentially dangerous. In the close-knit villages of medieval Europe, where you would have known your neighbor's business as intimately as your own, reputation could solidify into fact through repeated telling. A story of illness following a meal containing tomatoes would circulate, growing more dramatic with each retelling. By the time it had passed through the village and returned, perhaps a simple stomach upset had transformed into a tale of agonizing death, complete with tortured final words warning against the deadly fruit. Religious authorities, still powerful arbiters of what was acceptable in daily life, regarded New World imports with varying degrees of suspicion. Some argued that God had separated these foods from Europe for a reason, that consuming them represented a form of pride or overreaching. Others saw opportunities for metaphor and moral instruction. The tomato's hidden nature, potentially dangerous despite attractive appearance, offered obvious parallels to theological warnings about sin's deceptive allure. You might have heard a parish priest intone, "Like Eve tempted by fruit fair to the eye, but bringing death to the soul, so too must Christians guard against these foreign temptations, these apples of the heathen lands, which promise delight but deliver corruption." Such warnings, delivered from pulpits across Europe, reinforce caution around unfamiliar foods, especially those with already questionable reputations. The tomato's perceived effects on the body contributed to its fearsome reputation. Various cultures attributed to it powers both dangerous and enticing. It could cause fever, induce lust, create hallucinations, or compel unusual behavior. These beliefs stemmed partly from the tomato's nightshade connections, as some nightshades do indeed have psychoactive properties, and partly from the human tendency to project fears onto the unknown. In the great houses where physicians attended noble patients, you might have witnessed discussions of the tomato's supposed effects. The Count of such and such consumed these love apples at a banquet in Florence, a doctor might report, and before the night was through, had taken 3 serving maids to his bed and babbled of seeing demons in the corners of his chamber. Whether such effects came from the tomato itself, from other consumed substances, or simply from the power of suggestion, the association strengthened with each telling. Folk taxonomies of the period, the ways ordinary people categorize plants regardless of scientific classification, placed tomatoes firmly in the suspicious category. They were wolf peaches, mad apples, or poison apples, in various European languages, names reflecting deep-seated concerns about their safety. These colloquial names influence perception more strongly than the assessments of distant authorities or botanical classifications. In the herb gardens attached to monasteries, where much of Europe's medicinal knowledge was preserved and developed, the tomato occupied an ambiguous position. Some monastic gardeners grew it, experimentally, observing its properties and testing it in small quantities as a potential addition to their pharmacopoeia. Their cautious notes sometimes found their way into larger medical works, but often with ambiguous conclusions that did little to rehabilitate the tomato's reputation. Had you fallen ill in this period, the physician attending you might have warned against tomatoes as part of your recovery regimen. According to humoral theory, foods could exacerbate or ameliorate an illness depending on their innate qualities and the nature of the disease. Tomatoes, classified as cold and moist, would be contraindicated for any illness involving excess phlegm or cold humors, including many common ailments of the time. Only for certain hot conditions might tomatoes be cautiously prescribed, and even then in minimal quantities. The tomato's high water content and tendency to mold quickly in storage contributed to suspicions about its wholesomeness. In an era before refrigeration, food preservation was a serious concern. Fruits that spoiled rapidly were regarded as inherently less stable, more prone to corruption, and potentially dangerous even when apparently fresh. The tomato's quick transition from ripe to rotten seemed to confirm its fundamentally unstable nature. Walking through the aristocratic gardens of Renaissance Italy or Spain, where you might find yourself if serving a wealthy household, you would observe tomatoes growing as ornamental curiosities. Their vining habit made them suitable for trellises and decorative structures, their bright fruit adding color to green spaces. The same nobles who proudly displayed tomatoes in their gardens would often refuse to have them served at their tables, beauty and danger kept in careful balance. The culture of poisoning that reached its height during the Renaissance, particularly in Italian city-states, cast a long shadow over unfamiliar foods. Poisoning as a political tool had become so refined that professional poisoners commanded high prices for their services. Against this background, any new fruit, with even a hint of toxicity rumors, became automatically suspect. Who would risk consuming something that could so easily disguise a deliberate poisoning? In the crowded markets where common folk purchased their food, vendors selling exotic produce faced significant challenges. A tomato seller would need to overcome not only general suspicion of the unfamiliar, but specific rumors about this particular fruit. Some resorted to selling tomatoes purely as decorative items, carefully noting they were for ornament only, not for the table, a disclaimer protecting them from accusations should a customer ignore this warning and fall ill. The tomato's tendency to absorb lead from pewter and other dishes created a tragic feedback loop, reinforcing its deadly reputation. Among the wealthy, precisely those most likely to experiment with exotic foods, tomatoes could indeed prove indirectly fatal. The acidic fruit leached lead from pewter plates, causing lead poisoning, whose symptoms, abdominal pain, confusion, fatigue, headache, and eventually death, appeared to confirm the worst rumors about tomato toxicity. Had you been a cook in a noble household, you might have received explicit instructions never to serve tomatoes, no matter how fashionable they might become in other regions. The family's physician would have reinforced this prohibition with learned citations from classical authorities and contemporary medical scholarship. In such an environment, even curiosity about culinary applications would be discouraged, the mere suggestion potentially risking one's position. Court dynamics further complicated the tomato's reception. If a monarch or powerful noble expressed distaste for or fear of tomatoes, their entire circle would carefully avoid displaying any interest in the fruit. Conversely, if a ruler developed a taste for tomato preparations, as eventually happened in certain Mediterranean courts, courtiers might force themselves to partake despite personal misgivings, unwilling to seem less sophisticated than their social superiors. The scholarly literature documenting the tomato's European arrival reveals the conflicting assessments that must have bewildered ordinary people seeking guidance. Pietro Andrea Mattioli's Herbals described tomatoes as edible but not common fare. John Gerard's influential English Herbal warned against them. Spanish sources acknowledged their culinary use, while noting potential dangers if improperly prepared. No clear consensus emerged to counter the prevailing folk wisdom that tomatoes were best avoided. In the privacy of your own garden, had you been fortunate enough to possess one, you might have grown tomatoes, despite their fearsome reputation, but discreetly and with specific non-culinary purposes in mind. Their ornamental value was undeniable, and some believed they repelled certain insects or vermin. Others grew them for their supposed medicinal properties, harvesting them not for the kitchen, but for the still room where various tinctures and remedies were prepared. The mysterious death of aristocrats who had consumed tomatoes at important banquets sometimes made its way into popular ballads and cautionary tales. These stories, sung by traveling minstrels or repeated around winter fires, took on the quality of legend. The proud duke, who insisted on serving the forbidden fruit to impress foreign guests, found dead in his chamber by morning. The jealous countess, who eliminated her rival with a gift of love apples from her personal garden. Such dramatic narratives further cemented the tomato's deadly reputation in popular culture. Folk practitioners, wise women, cunning men, and other rural healers operating outside official medical hierarchies sometimes included tomatoes in their arsenals, but rarely for internal consumption. The fruit or leaves might be used in poultices for external applications, treating skin conditions or drawing out infections. These limited medicinal uses did little to rehabilitate the tomato as food, instead reinforcing the idea that it was more drug than nourishment, powerful but potentially dangerous. In the artistic representations of the period, tomatoes began appearing in still life paintings, particularly in Spanish and Italian works. These artistic depictions reveal much about contemporary perceptions. Tomatoes often appear alongside symbols of transience and mortality, or placed in positions suggesting both beauty and potential danger. The visual vocabulary of these paintings subtly reinforced the tomato's ambiguous status, something to be admired but approached with caution. The psychological power of color influenced perceptions of the tomato beyond conscious reasoning. Red's associations with blood, passion, and danger operate at a primal level across human cultures. The tomato's particular shade, brighter than most native European red fruits, triggered instinctive caution. This psychological response then sought rational justification, finding it in the various rumors, warnings, and ambiguous scientific assessments circulating about the fruit. As darkness deepens and your eyelids grow heavy, consider how the intertwining of fact and fiction shape the tomato's fearsome reputation. Like shadows cast by candlelight, these beliefs stretched and distorted reality, creating monsters from mere plants. The tomato became not just a questionable food, but a symbol of foreign danger, of nature's deceptive beauty, of knowledge best left unpursued. In the homes of common folk, where you would likely have dwelled, if not born to privilege, practicality often outweighed superstition. Food was too precious to waste on experiments, too essential to risk on novelties of uncertain safety. The familiar vegetables of European tradition, cabbages, onions, turnips, carrots, remained the foundation of daily sustenance, their reliability valued over the exotic allure of New World imports. The tomato might be discussed with fearful fascination, but it would not find its way into the cooking pot. Even as some Mediterranean regions began cautiously incorporating tomatoes into their cuisines, northern European countries maintained their resistance. Climate played a role in this division. Tomatoes grew more easily in southern warmth, allowing more opportunities for familiarity to overcome fear. In colder northern regions, where tomatoes struggled to ripen fully, their scarcity preserved their status as foreign curiosities rather than potential staples. The tomato's association with American indigenous cultures added another layer to European suspicions. Reports of Aztec human sacrifice and other practices Europeans considered barbaric created a context where all products of these civilizations were regarded through a lens of potential savagery. If these Heinz heathens ate tomatoes, some reasoned, perhaps Christians should exercise particular caution, especially given the fruit's devilish coloration. In the extensive correspondence between naturalists, physicians, and aristocratic plant collectors of the period, the tomato features with surprising frequency. These letters reveal ongoing debates about its properties, with first-hand observations often contradicting inherited wisdom. "I have consumed these fruits regularly this season," one Italian nobleman might write to a French counterpart, "and found them pleasant though unusual, with no ill effects beyond a slight loosening of the bowels." Such testimonials slowly accumulated, though they traveled far more slowly than fearful rumors. The religious symbolism attached to the tomato extended beyond mere suspicion of foreign foods. In some interpretations, its red color and juicy interior evoked Christ's blood and sacrifice, a connection that could be seen as either sacred or blasphemous, depending on the observer's perspective. This religious ambiguity paralleled the tomato's general status. Was it gift or threat, blessing or curse? The uncertainty itself became part of its identity in the European imagination. As the candle burns lower, casting longer shadows across ancient stone walls, consider that fear of the unknown remains one of humanity's most primal instincts. The tomato, bright and alien among familiar European produce, triggered this defensive wariness. Its journey from feared poison to beloved staple would require not just evidence of safety, but a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood their relationship to the natural world and its edible offerings. So they planted them, these strange fruits, in gardens, separated from food crops, beautiful curiosities kept at arm's length, admired but not consumed. They whispered about them in taverns and great halls alike, tales growing taller with each telling. They chronicled them in herbals with careful illustrations and cautious descriptions. But they did not, for the most part, eat them. Not yet. The tomato waited, ripening slowly in European consciousness for the day when fear would finally give way to familiarity and suspicion to culinary embrace. The night deepens around you, the candles flame, now barely illuminating the ancient pages of our tale. In this hushed darkness, we uncover the tragic misunderstanding at the heart of the tomato's fearsome reputation, a case of mistaken blame, of innocent fruit condemned for crimes committed by the very vessels meant to contain it. Draw closer as we examine the true culprit behind the deadly tomato, not the bright flesh of the fruit itself, but the dull gleam of pewter and lead that so often surrounded it. Imagine yourself in the dining hall of a prosperous noble family in late 16th century Europe. The table before you glimmers with the household's wealth, not in gold or silver, which might be reserved for the most special occasions, but in pewter, plates, goblets, and serving dishes with a dull silvery luster that speaks of solid prosperity. Pewter, an alloy primarily of tin with varying amounts of copper, antimony, bismuth, and crucially lead, had become the material of choice for those who could afford better than wooden trenchers, but lacked the extraordinary wealth required for precious metals. What neither you nor your hosts understand, what no one in this era fully comprehends, is the insidious chemical reaction about to unfold when acidic tomatoes meet lead-containing pewter. The tomato, innocent in itself, becomes the key that unlocks a genuine poison. Its natural acids leach lead from the dining vessels, creating lead acetate, sometimes called sugar of lead, for its deceptively sweet taste, which then contaminates the fruit itself. Had you been a physician called to attend a nobleman taken ill after a banquet featuring exotic tomatoes, you would have observed symptoms that seemed to confirm the worst suspicions about this New World fruit. The patient might experience severe abdominal pain, gut binding in the parlance of the time, along with headaches, confusion, and fatigue. In severe cases, seizures, hallucinations, or coma might follow. Eventually, if lead exposure continued, death. What conclusion could you draw, except that the tomatoes themselves were indeed the deadly poison everyone feared? The diary of Lady Elizabeth Harrington, an English noblewoman writing in 1594, recounts just such a tragedy. Lord C, having lately returned from travels in Spain, insisted upon serving at his table those red fruits they called tomatoes there, despite all warnings from his physician. He consumed them with particular relish, commenting upon their novel taste. Within a fortnight, he took to his bed with violent pains and confusion of the mind, raving of devils tormenting his entrails. He died shrieking, his final words a warning against the Spanish poison he had foolishly embraced. Let others be wiser. Such accounts spread through aristocratic networks via letters, visits, and gossip. Each seemingly confirmed what was already suspected. Tomatoes killed. What remained unexamined was the pattern that modern analysis would immediately recognize, that symptoms appeared not immediately, but days or weeks after consumption, a timeline consistent with lead poisoning rather than natural plant toxins, which typically act much more quickly. In the kitchen areas of great houses, where you might have worked, if born to certain stations, tomato preparation inadvertently increased the danger. Cooking tomatoes, stewing them into sauces or reductions, concentrated their acids while extending their contact time with pewter cookware. The result was even higher lead contamination than might occur with raw tomatoes briefly served. The very techniques that might have made tomatoes more palatable to European tastes were precisely those that rendered them most dangerous when prepared in lead-containing vessels. The tomb of Count Alessandro Ferdinando Marzetti in Florence bears a small carved tomato among its decorative elements, a seemingly strange choice until local records reveal he died in 1591, shortly after hosting a banquet where tomatoes imported from Spanish territories featured prominently. His grieving family, convinced the fruit had poisoned their patriarch, included it as warning to others about the dangers lurking in exotic foods. The irony that it was likely his prized pewter service rather than the tomato itself that caused his death would remain undiscovered for centuries. Had you been among the kitchen staff preparing such ill-fated meals, you might have noticed curious effects on metal utensils used with tomatoes. Spoons left in tomato dishes sometimes develop discoloration or pitting. Copper pots used for cooking tomato sauces might develop a particular verdigris, unlike that formed with other foods. These subtle signs of chemical reaction, when unrecognized for what they were, evidence not of the tomato's inherent toxicity, but of its interaction with the metals containing it. The tragedy extended beyond pewter plates to other sources of lead in affluent households. Lead glazes on ceramics, common in higher quality tableware, also reacted with acidic foods, including tomatoes. Lead water pipes, lead-containing food storage containers, even lead-based sweeteners used in some preserved fruits, all contributed to an environment where the aristocracy quite literally poisoned themselves daily, with tomatoes merely catalyzing the process. Funeral accounts from the period sometimes mention victims of supposed tomato poisoning being buried with unusual haste, their bodies discolored in death, their final hours marked by delirium or convulsions. These descriptions align perfectly with symptoms of acute lead poisoning, but were interpreted within the available frameworks of understanding, either as evidence of the tomato's virulent nature, or, in some cases, as signs of diabolic influence or divine punishment for exotic indulgence. The scientific understanding required to identify this deadly interaction lay centuries in the future. Neither the chemical properties of acids nor the specific toxicology of lead was sufficiently understood. Experimental methods that might have isolated variables and identified cause and effect had not yet been developed. The tomato was judged guilty based on circumstantial evidence, condemned without the possibility of a fair trial by the scientific limitations of the age. In the quieter corners of Europe, particularly among peasant populations who ate from wooden or ceramic vessels containing little or no lead, a different story unfolded. Here, where tomatoes were occasionally grown and consumed without incident, puzzlement arose at the dire warnings from above. A Calabrian folk song from the early 17th century gently mocks this class divide. The Lords say the red fruit brings death and devils, yet we eat it and live to work another day. Perhaps death only claims those with silver spoons, while wooden bowls keep humble men safe from harm. This observation contained more truth than its composers knew. The class-stratified nature of lead poisoning, affecting primarily the wealthy with their superior metal vessels, created a situation where first-hand experience contradicted between social groups. Those most likely to be heeded, the educated and wealthy, genuinely experienced tomatoes as dangerous, while those whose safe consumption might have rehabilitated the fruit's reputation, common folk using lead-free implements, were dismissed as having constitutions hardened by labor or simply too ignorant to recognize subtle symptoms. Medical treatises of the period occasionally came tantalizingly close to identifying the true culprit. A Venetian physician, writing in 1606, observed that certain red fruits lately arrived from the Americas seemed to cause illness, primarily among the wealthy, suggesting perhaps that their refined constitutions are more susceptible to foreign influences than the robust systems of laborers. The classist assumption prevented him from considering that the wealthy's eating environment, rather than their constitution, might be the critical difference. In the great kitchens where experimental cooking sometimes occurred, observant cooks occasionally noted patterns we now recognize as significant. A French chef's notebook from 1622 contains this cryptic entry: "The red love apples, when stewed long in the master's favorite copper pot, develop a sweetness not present when prepared in earthenware." However, those served from copper invariably result in complaints of stomach distress by the following day. Perhaps earthenware better preserves their natural character. This accidental experiment in metallurgy went unrecognized for the revelation it was. Had you been a servant in a noble household, you might have witnessed the tragic cycle repeatedly. an adventurous lord or lady, perhaps influenced by Mediterranean travels where tomato consumption was becoming more common, would instruct the kitchen to prepare the forbidden fruit. Initial enjoyment would be followed, days or weeks later, by illness, whose connection to that particular meal was rarely made. If the master recovered, the incident might be forgotten. If death resulted, blame would fall on the mysterious tomato rather than the accumulated lead exposure from every meal taken on pewter plates. Forensic examination of remains from the period, conducted centuries later, would reveal shocking lead levels in the bones of aristocrats compared to peasants, sometimes 10 to 20 times higher concentrations. These findings explain not only deaths attributed to tomatoes, but also the general poor health, mental instability, and shortened lifespans common among the European nobility. The tomato was merely the most visible scapegoat for a much broader poisoning that occurred with every meal taken from lead-containing vessels. The bitter irony of the situation becomes clear when we consider that in some regions, apothecaries actually prescribed lead compounds as medicine for various ailments. Lead acetate, the very compound formed when acidic tomatoes contacted pewter, was used to treat diarrhea, bleeding, and certain skin conditions. Some patients were literally prescribed the same poison that was killing them when they ate tomatoes from pewter plates, creating a deadly circle of misunderstanding. In the homes of the most wealthy, where gold and silver rather than pewter dominated the table, tomatoes occasionally found earlier acceptance. These precious metals do not react with acidic foods in the same dangerous way. A Florentine banker's records from 1617 note expenses for both silver platters and tomato seeds, alongside a recipe for Spanish sauce of the crimson fruit, most fashionable in elegant circles this season. This correlation between truly precious metals and safer tomato consumption went unnoticed at the time. The tragedy of the poisoned plate extended beyond Europe to colonial settlements, where attempts to recreate European lifestyles included importing pewter when possible. In these settings, the deadly cycle repeated, colonists attempting to use local produce with European dining conventions, sometimes paid with their health or lives, particularly when native fruits like tomatoes featured in their adaptations. A physician's report from New Spain, colonial Mexico, in 1675, contains a particularly clear observation of the phenomenon, though its significance wasn't understood. Most curious is the effect of the local red fruit called tomate upon the health of those newly arrived. Natives consume it daily without apparent harm, eating directly from the vine or from their simple clay dishes. Yet when our Spanish settlers prepare the same fruit in their fine metal cookware, illness frequently follows. Some believe the natives possess special knowledge of preparation techniques that render the fruit safe, while others claim their bodies have developed resistance through generations of exposure. The gradual recognition that tomatoes might not be inherently poisonous came through accumulated contradictory evidence that eventually could not be ignored. Reports from Italy described peasants consuming tomatoes regularly, without ill effect. Travelers to Mexico observed native populations using tomatoes as dietary staples. Botanical studies confirmed the tomato's relationship to edible potatoes and peppers, rather than focusing exclusively on its connections to deadly nightshade. Slowly, the weight of evidence shifted. Yet even as scientific understanding advanced in other areas, the specific connection between lead, acid, and illness remained obscure. Not until the 19th century would the mechanisms of lead poisoning be sufficiently understood to fully exonerate the tomato. In the meantime, generations lived in unnecessary fear of a nutritious fruit, or worse, suffered actual poisoning from the interaction between innocent tomatoes and dangerous dining vessels. Among the many victims of this tragic misunderstanding was Count Paolo Vincenzo Borghese, whose 1646 funeral monument in Rome includes a particularly detailed account of his death. Stricken in his prime by consumption of foreign fruit, he suffered greatly for 17 days, his mind clouded, his limbs trembling, until God in mercy received his tortured soul. Modern analysis suggests classic lead poisoning, likely accelerated by his documented fondness for tomato preserves served from lead-glazed containers, specially imported from Spain. The kitchens of Europe, had you worked in them during this period, contained numerous opportunities for similar poisonings beyond just tomatoes. Vinegar, wine, fruit preserves, anything acidic could and did leach lead from inappropriate containers. The tomato became notorious, not because it was uniquely dangerous, but because its novelty meant any problems following its consumption were closely scrutinized and widely reported, while familiar foods causing identical symptoms through the same mechanism escaped similar censure. As daylight wanes and shadows lengthen, consider the cruel irony. The wealthy, with their superior resources and access to exotic foods, actually endangered themselves through their material prosperity. The pewter plate, symbol of their elevated status, silently poisoned them with every meal. Meanwhile, the humble wooden bowls and simple pottery of peasant households, though less prestigious, proved safer for acidic foods like tomatoes. Status and safety stood in inverse relationship, an equation understood only centuries later. Historical records occasionally capture moments when the truth nearly emerged. A letter from a Tuscan aristocrat to his brother in 1659 observes, "Most peculiar is the effect of these golden apples, as they are called. When served fresh in the garden, cut and eaten directly, they cause no distress. Yet the same fruit, when brought to table on our grandfather's pewter service, resulted in fearful pains the following day." Perhaps something in the air of the dining room disagrees with their nature. So close to understanding, yet conceptual frameworks of the time prevented the critical connection. Household inventories from the period reveal another subtle pattern. Families who dined primarily from silver or gold service occasionally note tomato-based dishes in their kitchen records, while those dependent on pewter rarely mention tomatoes except as ornamental garden plants. This correlation, invisible to contemporaries, speaks volumes to modern analysts about the material conditions that shaped culinary acceptance or rejection of the tomato. The dangerous union of tomato acid and lead affected more than just health. It influenced international relations, trade, and colonial dynamics. Spanish and Italian acceptance of tomatoes developed earlier than in Northern Europe, partly due to different dining customs and vessel materials. These regional variations in tomato adoption became markers of cultural identity, with lasting impacts on national cuisines that persist to this day, all stemming from an unrecognized chemical reaction between food and plate. As the candle gutters in the deepening night, we must acknowledge the tragic dimension of this historical misunderstanding. Lives cut short, suffering endured, a nutritious food rejected for centuries, all because science had not yet developed the frameworks needed to distinguish between correlation and causation, between the tomato itself and the deadly environment in which it was served. The tomato stood accused of crimes it did not commit, condemned without fair trial by the limitations of pre-modern understanding. This cautionary tale extends beyond mere culinary history. It reminds us how easily humans attribute harm to the most visible, unusual element in a situation rather than investigating more complex, less obvious causes. The foreign, the novel, the different becomes suspect, primarily because of its unfamiliarity, while everyday dangers hide in plain sight, protected by their very commonness from critical examination. The candle has burned low now, its light softening the shadows as we approach the final chapter of our tale. After centuries of fear and misunderstanding, the tomato's journey toward redemption begins, a slow rehabilitation from feared poison to beloved staple. As you drift toward sleep, let us trace this unlikely transformation, watching as suspicion gradually yields to curiosity, then acceptance, and finally celebration of the fruit once considered too dangerous to touch. The first glimmers of the tomato's redemption appeared in unlikely places, the gardens and kitchens of the poor, particularly in southern Europe, where necessity often overcame superstition. In the sun-drenched fields of southern Italy, where you might have labored if born to certain circumstances in the late 17th century, food scarcity made experimenting with the prolific tomato plant increasingly attractive. When hunger presses close, fear of poison becomes a luxury one cannot afford. Italian peasants, observing that tomatoes grew abundantly with minimal tending, began incorporating them into their diets out of pragmatism rather than preference. Using clay pots rather than pewter or copper, they avoided the lead poisoning that had reinforced fears among the wealthy. Their continued health, despite regular tomato consumption, created a powerful counter-narrative to the fruit's deadly reputation, though one that spread slowly given the limited communication between social classes. A Neapolitan folk remedy book from 1692 contains perhaps the first written recipe for what we might recognize as tomato sauce. Take the red love apples when fully ripened in the sun. Remove their skins by brief immersion in boiling water. Crush them well and cook slowly with garlic, oil, and herbs in an earthen pot until thickened. This sauce preserves well and adds savor to the humblest bread or pasta. The critical detail, the earthen pot, allowed safe consumption without the lead poisoning that had doomed earlier aristocratic experiments. In Spain, where tomatoes had been grown ornamentally for over a century, similar patterns emerged. The gazpacho of Andalusia, originally a bread and garlic soup, began incorporating tomatoes among the poorest populations, creating an inexpensive yet nourishing dish that gradually spread upward through society. The Spanish innovation of preparing tomatoes raw rather than cooked further reduced any chance of toxicity, as uncooked tomatoes spend less time in contact with serving vessels. Had you visited the markets of Naples or Seville in the early 18th century, you might have noticed something unthinkable 100 years earlier: vendors openly selling tomatoes for culinary use, and customers still primarily from the lower classes purchasing them without apparent concern. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but rather through a slow accumulation of experience. Generations eating tomatoes without ill effect gradually eroded even the most entrenched fears. The scientific revolution, beginning in the 17th century, eventually provided intellectual frameworks that helped rehabilitate the tomato. As experimental methods replaced reliance on classical authorities, botanists began systematically cataloging plants according to observable characteristics rather than traditional associations or humoral qualities. The tomato's relationship to other edible nightshades became clearer, while its resemblance to deadly nightshade was properly contextualized. Carolus Linnaeus, developing his revolutionary taxonomic system in the mid-18th century, classified the tomato as Solanum lycopericum, acknowledging its nightshade family connections, while distinguishing it from truly poisonous relatives. This scientific legitimacy helped separate the tomato from purely superstitious fears, though lingering concerns about its safety persisted in more conservative regions. The French Revolution and subsequent upheavals across Europe played an unexpected role in the tomato's rehabilitation. As traditional social orders collapsed and reformed, many cultural assumptions came under scrutiny, including food taboos. The revolutionary spirit embraced the tomato as an egalitarian food, one that had been safely consumed by peasants while aristocrats feared it. Thomas Jefferson, deeply influenced by French revolutionary thought, became an early American tomato advocate, growing them at Monticello and serving them to guests despite lingering American suspicions. Cookbooks began reflecting this changing status. The 1773 Italian cookbook Il Cuoco Galante by Vincenzo Corrado included multiple tomato preparations, noting their increasing popularity in southern Italian cuisine. The recipe specifically recommended earthenware for cooking tomatoes, a practical instruction that inadvertently protected consumers from lead exposure, though the author likely intended it as a matter of flavor rather than safety. In colonial contexts, cultural exchange accelerated tomato acceptance. European settlers in tomato-growing regions observed indigenous populations consuming them without ill effect. Gradually, colonial cuisines incorporated tomatoes through a process of adaptation and experimentation. These colonial innovations sometimes traveled back to Europe, arriving with the apparent endorsement of exotic experience and adventure rather than bearing the taint of peasant necessity. Had you visited a fashionable Parisian restaurant in the late 18th century, you might have encountered tomatoes presented as a sophisticated colonial delicacy rather than a feared poison, though primarily in establishments catering to progressive intellectuals rather than conservative traditionalists. This reframing of the tomato as exotic and adventurous rather than dangerous helped overcome lingering resistance among the educated classes. The Industrial Revolution, with its new manufacturing techniques and materials, inadvertently contributed to safer tomato consumption. As ceramic production became more standardized and lead-free glazes more common, the risk of lead poisoning from acidic foods like tomatoes naturally decreased. Simultaneously, pewter declined in popularity as ceramic and new types of metalware became more accessible. With the primary mechanism of tomato poisoning gradually eliminated, experiences of tomato consumption became increasingly positive. Medical understanding slowly caught up to reality. By the early 19th century, physicians began explicitly rejecting the notion that tomatoes were inherently poisonous, though many continued to consider them potentially disruptive to digestion or suitable only for certain constitutions. Dr. John Cook Bennett conducted public demonstrations of tomato consumption in the 1830s, eating a tomato before crowds who had gathered expecting to witness his death, a theatrical refutation of lingering American fears. Botanical gardens and early agricultural experimenters championed the tomato for its productivity and nutritional potential. In an era increasingly concerned with feeding growing urban populations, the tomato's high yield and vitamin content, though vitamins themselves weren't yet understood, made it increasingly attractive. Agricultural bulletins from the early 19th century began actively promoting tomato cultivation rather than merely acknowledging its existence. In the developing field of nutrition, the tomato found new advocates. By the 1840s, health reformers like Sylvester Graham of graham cracker fame promoted tomatoes as part of a wholesome diet. Though their understanding of nutrition was still primitive by modern standards, these early health advocates helped rebrand the tomato as beneficial rather than dangerous, part of a larger shift toward vegetable consumption as health-promoting rather than merely necessary. Seed catalogs from the mid-19th century reveal the tomato's triumphant rehabilitation. What had once been listed as an ornamental curiosity, if mentioned at all, now appeared prominently among vegetable offerings, with multiple varieties described in enticing terms. The trophy tomato produces fruit of extraordinary size and smoothness, solid flesh of finest flavor, suitable for all culinary purposes. No kitchen garden should be without it. Technologies of food preservation particularly elevated the tomato's status. Canning, developed in the early 19th century, found in the tomato an ideal candidate, acidic enough to remain safe with minimal processing, flavorful enough to enhance many dishes. Commercial tomato canning began in the 1830s, and by mid-century, tomato preserves had become a pantry staple across economic classes. The ability to enjoy tomatoes year-round accelerated their integration into everyday cooking. The great waves of Italian immigration to America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries cemented the tomato's culinary significance in the New World. Italian Americans brought their tomato-based cooking traditions, adapting them to American ingredients and gradually introducing them to the broader population. What had begun as ethnic food gradually transformed into American classics: spaghetti with tomato sauce, pizza with tomato topping, and eventually ketchup as a distinctly American tomato preparation. Had you visited an American or European kitchen in the early 20th century, you would have discovered the tomato thoroughly rehabilitated, a transformation so complete that few remembered it had once been considered deadly. Cookbook authors no longer felt compelled to defend tomato recipes or assure readers of their safety. The tomato had completed its journey from poisonous interloper to essential ingredient, its former fearsome reputation fading into historical curiosity. The ultimate symbol of the tomato's redemption may be its industrialization. When Henry J. Heinz began mass-producing tomato ketchup in the late 19th century, he transformed a once feared fruit into a product so thoroughly accepted that it would eventually be particularly marketed to children. The substance once believed to cause madness and death became a staple on children's plates, the ultimate vote of confidence from formerly fearful cultures. Scientific understanding eventually provided a comprehensive explanation for the tomato's troublesome history. As lead toxicology became better understood in the 20th century, researchers could finally explain the apparent contradictions in historical experiences of tomato consumption. The fruit itself was exonerated, while the true culprit, the interaction of acidic foods with lead-containing vessels, was properly identified. Early 20th century research into vitamins further rehabilitated the tomato's reputation. The discovery that tomatoes contained significant quantities of what would later be identified as vitamin C and vitamin A transformed them from merely acceptable food to positively health-promoting. During World War II, Victory Gardens prominently featured tomatoes as nutritious, easy-to-grow contributions to the war effort, the final validation of a food once considered too dangerous to touch. Modern tomato production scales almost defy comprehension. Today, over 180 million tons of tomatoes are produced annually worldwide, making them one of the most important food crops globally. They appear in cuisines across continents, have been bred into countless varieties, and feature in processed foods from soups to sauces to juices. The former poison apple now represents approximately $85 billion in annual global economic activity. The tomato's journey reminds us how fluid human certainties can be, how what one generation knows beyond doubt, another questions, and a third embraces as self-evident truth. The progression from fear to acceptance required not just scientific advancement, but cultural openness, economic necessity, and culinary creativity. No single moment marks the tomato's redemption. Rather, it was rehabilitated through countless small experiences of safe consumption, gradually accumulating into a new consensus. As your eyelids grow heavy and sleep approaches, consider how the tomato's story mirrors broader human patterns. We fear what we do not understand, attribute danger to the unfamiliar rather than examining our own assumptions, resist change until necessity or opportunity becomes too compelling to ignore. Then, adaptation complete, we forget we ever thought differently. The tomato shifted from deadly nightshade to comfort food, not because it changed, but because we did. Perhaps most poignant is how the tomato's dangerousness was simultaneously true and false. Those who feared it weren't simply superstitious. People really did sicken and die after consuming tomatoes. Yet the tomato itself was innocent, merely the visible actor in a complex chemical drama it didn't create. This nuanced reality, where perception and fact intertwine in complicated ways, offers wisdom deeper than simple narratives of ignorance overcome by knowledge. The humble tomato on your kitchen counter, destined for tomorrow's meal, carries this rich history within its glossy skin. From feared poison to beloved staple, from exotic curiosity to global commodity, it has witnessed the transformation of human understanding across centuries. As you drift into sleep, let the tomato's patient journey from fear to fondness remind you how even the most entrenched beliefs can change, given time and evidence, and the human capacity for reconsideration. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be as peaceful as a sun-warmed tomato, finally accepted after centuries of suspicion, resting securely in the knowledge of its own harmlessness. Tonight, as we have done throughout history, we lay aside our fears and find comfort in the familiar, even in what was once the most feared fruit in Europe,